You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
First question. Is Syracuse basketball broke? Do they have no money? Do they have no NIL? Well, the article actually dives into that. According to sources in the article, Syracuse's NIL budget for this season was a little more than $2 million. Now, I could throw out a number and say $2 million, but you would have no idea what that actually means. There needs to be context behind it. Well, according to the article, a little more than $2 million was middle of the pack in the ACC as far as NIL budget. But for context, Louisville, one of the better programs in the country now, had an NIL budget of about $4.5 million, and they are currently a projected 6th seed in the latest ESPN bracketology. So again, it goes back to what I have been saying for a while now, which is that Syracuse, heading into this season, did not have the NIL to be able to compete with the big boys and be a top seed in March Madness. But there is still no reason. NIL is not a valid excuse for the fact that Syracuse is 11-16 and 147 overall in the net rankings. In fact, let's go over some schools that are actually ahead of Syracuse in the net rankings. Are you ready? And you could tell me yes or no whether or not you think that these schools have more NIL resources than Syracuse. Ready? Let's do it. Furman, Towson, DePaul, James Madison, New Mexico State, Western Kentucky, Kennesaw State. You want me to keep going? Those are the only schools that I listed that are above Syracuse in the net basketball rankings. You tell me who has more NIL, Syracuse or James Madison, Syracuse or Kennesaw State. So NIL, as far as it being a valid excuse, to some extent, because Syracuse cannot be a 1 seed, 2 seed, 3 seed. They're not on that level, but I mean, 11-16 overall, one of the worst teams in the ACC. Give me a break. It's not a valid reason. Furthermore, this article really grinded my gears. It starts off talking about the Kadary Richmond saga when he entered the portal. Kadary Richmond was one of the top transfer portal players available last offseason, and he entered it on April 25th at the very end of the transfer portal window. It's entirely possible that Syracuse had more than a little over $2 million that they're leading you to believe. And I'm going to tell you why. Because in the article, it says that Syracuse offered Kadary Richmond $700,000 to play for Syracuse. Ultimately, that wasn't even close to being enough because Kadary Richmond ended up signing with St. John's for $1.2 million. I don't care how many relationships you have. You are not going to get a player to take a $500,000 discount. $1.2 million versus $700,000, that's not being in the ballpark. You're not even in the same area code at that point. You're not even close. But what I found interesting is that Syracuse offered $700,000 to Kadary Richmond to play for Syracuse when basically every move was done. The roster was nearly set in stone when they offered him $700,000. There were only 2 moves that Syracuse made after Kadary Richmond. You ready? It was Lucas Taylor in the transfer portal from Georgia State and Peter Mastorovich, the true freshman from Europe. I can promise you that those 2 players do not combine to make $700,000. In fact, it is significantly less. So the idea that Syracuse is just broke, A, not entirely true because they were already middle of the pack in the ACC, and B, where did the $700,000 come from to offer Kadary Richmond? Hello? Bueller? Anyone care to explain? Was it special money that they only had available for Kadary, but if it wasn't used for Kadary, they simply weren't going to use it? $700,000 is a lot of money, I should say. It doesn't just pop out of thin air. So I'm not really buying that Syracuse is broke. I understand that they were middle of the pack in the ACC, but they came up with $700,000 at the end of the offseason to give to Kadary Richmond when they only made 2 moves after Kadary Richmond said no. Lucas Taylor and Peter Mastorovich. Eddie Lampkin had already signed. Jyare Davis had already signed. Jaquan Carlos had already signed. They already knew that they were getting those players. Number two, we learned J.J. Starling's value. Now, before we get to J.J. Starling's value, when you're on a tight budget, your margin for error is really thin, right? You cannot afford to make mistakes on value because when you make those mistakes, you cannot spend more money to overcome those mistakes. Like when a program like Louisville, who's spending $4.5 million on its players, makes a mistake, they can overcome it because they have more money available to spend, right? But when Syracuse, let's say operating at about $2 million, a little more than that, when they make a mistake, your margin for error is a lot thinner. That also means you're going to need to find players on value contracts, value NIL deals, players that are outperforming their value. Well, we learned in this article from Mike Waters that J.J. Starling is massively underpaid. He is making less than $300,000 in NIL this season. That is less than Frank Anselem, Louisville's apparent third-string center. Oh, by the way, you remember Frank Anselem? Frank Anselem played for Syracuse in 21 and 2022. According to the Mike Waters' article, he's making $300,000. Are you kidding me? I'd take J.J. Starling for that. If I were to say conservatively, if J.J. were to hit the open market right now, $500,000 is probably a fair estimate given the market. But he's only making $300,000, so they're losing. They're 11 and 16 overall, in danger of missing the ACC tournament, despite the fact that their best player is on a bargain deal. Yeah, that's not very good. That's an indictment on this coaching staff. Really? It'd be one thing if J.J. Starling was making, I don't know, at least $500,000, $750,000. Then he would maybe have a little bit more of a case, right? That's not necessarily good. That's maybe fair value, but that's not an overperformance. But you're getting a lot more than what you're paying for from J.J. Starling. And I've had my criticisms of him. I do not think he's a perfect player, but he's worth more than what he's getting, and you're still losing. So overall, is Syracuse basketball broke? I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it from this article. Again, it's in it. Facts, according to sources, they're spending more than $2 million. That's middle of the pack in the ACC. Not great, but also $700,000 just appears out of nowhere to get Kadary Richmond, which wasn't even close to being enough, but you still had that extra $700,000 when most of the moves that you made that offseason were already done. So they're not broke. And we learned that in this article.